The morning fog hangs heavy over the manicured lawns of Greenwich, Connecticut. My name is Margaret. I'm 62 years old. My husband Robert died last spring. 9 days after the funeral, a default notice arrived from the bank. $850,000 borrowed against my home by my brother-in-law Marcus, to fund the company Robert built with his own hands. Marcus was a man my husband and I had pulled back from the edge of bankruptcy. When his business collapsed and the debts buried him, we put our home on the line so he could start over. That same Marcus treated me like a stranger in his company hallway. He was looking at his Rolex. I had gone there to demand repayment. That money was his debt to settle, not my burden to carry. I was there to tell him, repay what you borrowed, before the bank takes my house. We can't pull capital right now, Marcus said. Personal matters aren't a priority. The words came out as if they were obvious. I steadied myself and tried again. This was the house we had put up together as collateral, I told him. The house I was now about to lose. Marcus, this is my home, I said. Maybe it's time to look into assisted living, Marcus said, meeting my eyes. You're not as sharp as you used to be. His gaze moved past my shoulder. In that moment, I understood. He had never intended to repay a single dollar. The plan was to dump that debt squarely on me and take my house in the process. That night, I sat in my kitchen with the power out. Empty pill organizer. A document arrived from his own shell company and offered to pay my living expenses in exchange for signing over the deed to my house. My name was already printed on the signature line. He thought I was a fragile widow waiting to break. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. He had no idea I was about to become the storm he never saw coming. He never thought to look inside Robert's old drafting table. The lilies were Robert's idea, years ago, when they'd attended the Hendersons' funeral on the other side of town. Get good lilies, he'd told her, the way he said everything quietly, with the certainty of a man who had already thought 3 steps ahead. The cheap ones smell like a waiting room. People deserve better than that. She'd ordered the good ones. They filled the sunroom now, white and heavy-headed, their fragrance so thick it had become its own kind of pressure against her temples. Margaret Vance sat in the wingback chair she'd reupholstered twice in 40 years of marriage. Her hands wrapped around a cup of Earl Grey that had gone cold sometime in the last hour. She hadn't noticed. She'd stopped noticing small things. The day had a way of doing that, compressing the ordinary details, the temperature of tea, the angle of afternoon light. The particular quality of silence that settles into a house after the last car pulls out of the driveway and the neighbors stop bringing casseroles and suddenly it is just you and the rooms you filled together, and the understanding, arriving slowly and then all at once, that they are simply rooms now. The funeral had been Tuesday. This was Thursday. She set the cup on the side table and looked at the papers in her lap. The HELOC statement had arrived in the mail the previous week, sandwiched between a condolence card from Robert's college roommate and a catalog for garden supplies she'd never ordered. Home equity line of credit. The words had the bureaucratic flatness of all financial documents, the kind designed to be unreadable until they were unavoidable. She'd unfolded it the same morning she'd received the sympathy flowers from the firm, set it on Robert's mahogany desk, and told herself she would look at it properly when she could think properly. She was looking at it now. $850,000. The number sat there on the page with a patience that felt almost cruel. Not a typo, not a filing error. $850,000. Borrowed against the Greenwich house against the Colonial with the wraparound porch and the kitchen Robert had renovated the summer. Their daughter Hannah turned 12 and the sunroom where she was sitting right now, all of it leveraged to fund Marcus's expansion. The expansion that was going to change everything for Vance Logistics. The expansion that Robert had believed in, or had said he believed in the careful way he said things he was uncertain about. Marcus just needs one last push. She could hear his voice as clearly as if he were standing in the doorway. She turned her head without meaning to, and the doorway was empty, and the faint disorientation of that the involuntary turning. The empty space was something she was still learning to absorb. She'd told herself it was fine. He'd told her it was fine. They had discussed it at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning in March. Marcus's proposal spread between their coffee cups, and Robert had been careful and calm the way he always was when he was worried about something. He'd said Marcus had restructured the liability. He'd said the equity was protected. He'd used words that, she realized now sitting in the cold tea quiet, she had trusted without fully parsing because she had trusted him, and trusting him had always been the same as understanding. Her phone buzzed on the armrest. The Ring camera notification. She lifted it and watched the small, silent video. Marcus and Chloe were on the front walk, moving toward the street with the particular efficiency of people who have decided a situation no longer requires them. Marcus had his jacket over his arm. Chloe was laughing, not loudly, not obviously, but the way she always laughed at things that didn't seem funny to anyone else. A small, private amusement curving the corner of her mouth. They stepped into the Maybach without looking back at the house. The camera caught the car door closing. The timestamp read 2:47 p.m. The wake had been scheduled until 5. Margaret set the phone down. She pressed Robert's number. The voicemail engaged before the first ring completed. "You've reached Robert Vance. Please leave a message and I'll return your call." She ended the call, looked at the screen. Then, because some part of her could not quite stop, she pressed Marcus's number instead. Voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand, listening to the recorded voice of Marcus's assistant explaining that Mr. Vance was unavailable and would return her call at his earliest convenience. And then she tried once more and got the same message and placed the phone face down on the side table next to the cold cup of tea. 5 times now. 5 calls since the burial. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked the way it always had, measured and deliberate, the sound that had been background noise for 4 decades. She had bought it at an estate auction in Westport the year they moved in. And Robert had complained gently about its weight going up the stairs, and she had told him it built character, and he had laughed, and they had been young enough that everything was still worth laughing about. The clock ticked now with the same rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. It occurred to her, sitting in the silence with the papers in her lap, and the lilies losing their last trace of scent into the afternoon air, that the ticking sounded different than it used to. More like counting, less like keeping time. She smoothed the HELOC statement against her knee and made herself read it again from the beginning. Not to find a mistake, she was a nurse practitioner. She had spent 30 years reading numbers without sentiment. Blood pressure and oxygen saturation and medication dosages. The kind of reading that required you to see what was there rather than what you hoped was there. The statement said what it said. $850,000. The collateral was the property at this address, the Colonial in Greenwich. The house she had raised Hannah in and grown old in and expected, with the quiet certainty of someone who had never had reason to doubt it, to keep. She thought about Marcus standing at the lectern during the service, composed and grief-stricken in the way of a man who had practiced the expression. She thought about Chloe's hand on her arm, warm and temporary, the brief squeeze that conveyed everything and nothing. She thought about the board members from Vance Logistics who had filled the 3rd row of pews. People she had fed dinners to, who had shaken her hand and said Robert was a giant, a visionary, a man the industry would not soon replace. Maybe I'm just overthinking this. The thought arrived quietly, without conviction. Grief makes ghosts out of everyone. She looked at the red notification on her phone. Missed call Marcus Vance. It stared back at her with the accusatory patience of a thing that already knew the answer. The screen went dark. The grandfather clock ticked. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street, and its headlights swept briefly through the window and crossed the far wall, and then it was gone and the room returned to the specific, particular silence of a house where someone used to live and now doesn't. Margaret Vance sat in the wingback chair with the HELOC statement in her hands and Robert's favorite cup of cold Earl Grey on the table beside her. And she breathed the last of the lily fragrance, and she waited for the phone to ring. It didn't. The registered letter arrived on a Wednesday, 9 days after the funeral. Margaret saw it through the glass panel of the mailbox before she even opened the door. The kind of envelope the post office requires a signature for, thick and official, bearing the return address of a law firm she didn't recognize in New Haven. She signed the carrier's form with the automatic courtesy of someone who has not yet understood what she is signing for. Carried it inside, and set it on the kitchen counter beside her coffee. She finished the coffee first. She had learned, in 30 years of nursing, that the worst news does not improve with rushing. The notice of default was 7 pages long. She read it twice. The language was dense and precise and designed, she suspected, to be just difficult enough that the average recipient might feel compelled to simply comply rather than fight. But Margaret Vance had spent 3 decades reading physician shorthand and pharmaceutical inserts and the fine print of insurance authorizations. And she understood the document well enough. The bank was calling the loan. The terms of the HELOC, as structured, contained an acceleration clause. If the borrower failed to maintain minimum payments for 90 consecutive days, the entire balance became immediately due. Someone had failed to maintain minimum payments. 90 days had passed. The entire balance was now immediately due. $850,000. She drove to Vance Logistics that same afternoon. Her Volvo was 12 years old and reliable in the way that quietly dependable things are reliable without drama or announcement. She had driven it to Hannah's high school graduation and to Robert's last cardiology appointment and to the hospice 3 times a week in the final month. It moved through the executive parking lot of Vance Logistics now like a held breath. Pulling into a visitor's space between a Tesla Model S and something German and low to the ground that she didn't recognize. The lot was full. Business, apparently, was proceeding. She straightened her coat and walked toward the entrance. Gerald Simmons had worked the security desk at Vance Logistics for 11 years. She knew his name because Robert had told her. She knew he had a daughter at UConn studying environmental science and a wife who made excellent Portuguese bread. And a soft spot for the Yankees that Robert had teased him about every October. She knew these things because Robert had believed that the people who worked for you were worth knowing. Gerald looked up when she pushed through the glass door, and something happened in his face, not unfriendliness. Exactly, but a rapid, uncomfortable reassembly of expression, the look of a man who has received instructions he doesn't entirely approve of. And has decided, for reasons of livelihood, to follow them anyway. Mrs. Vance, he was already reaching for the phone. Let me just if you could wait in the seating area. Of course, she said. She sat. Her wallet slipped from her hands as she reached for her ID. And she crouched to gather the contents: loyalty cards, a library card from a town she hadn't lived in for 20 years, her Medicare card. She held it for a moment before tucking it back. The laminated edge was worn soft from years of handling. She was 62 years old, and she was sitting in a lobby that Robert had designed and Marcus had redecorated, waiting to be seen by a man who had not returned her calls in 9 days, and the Medicare card in her fingers. Felt suddenly, unexpectedly, like an answer to a question she hadn't wanted to ask. She looked up at the lobby wall. The plaque was new, polished mahogany, brass lettering. Marcus Vance, sole visionary. She studied it for a long moment, cataloging the words with the same dispassionate attention she would bring to an abnormal reading on a patient chart. Sole, not founding visionary, not current CEO. Sole, Robert Vance, who had sketched the original logistics model on a legal pad at their kitchen table in 1999, who had worked 18-hour days through the company's first 3 years while Marcus was still finding himself in Scottsdale, whose name had appeared alongside Marcus's on every piece of company stationery for 2 decades. That name was no longer on the wall. The space where it would have been was simply wall. Marcus appeared 20 minutes later. He didn't come from the elevator. He materialized from a side corridor, already moving, his phone in one hand and his sleeve rolled to reveal the Rolex in the other. And he stopped when he reached her with the energy of a man who has allocated exactly as much time to this conversation as he intends to spend. He did not suggest his office. Margaret. He gave her the practiced version of warmth, a brief clasp of her elbow, a sympathetic compression of his features. This is a difficult time for all of us. I received a default notice this morning, she said. She kept her voice level. The bank is accelerating the loan. He exhaled through his nose. These things move on their own schedule. Finance is complicated right now. The whole sector is recalibrating. We can't just pull capital out of the business for personal needs during a transitional period. He glanced at his Rolex. Not because he needed to know the time, she understood. Because he wanted her to see that he was glancing at it. Marcus, this isn't a personal need. This is the house. This is the collateral you asked us to put up. Robert put up. The correction was immediate and gentle and deliberate. And he made that decision as a partner of the business, not as look. He lowered his voice, tilted his head in the direction of the front desk, as though what he was about to say required discretion. I've been meaning to mention this. Some of the board members have been expressing concerns. About you. About the calls, the letters. You've been under enormous stress, and grief does things to us. I am not under anything, she said quietly. I'm under a foreclosure notice. Something moved behind his eyes, not remorse, she thought. Not even discomfort, more like a recalculation. He looked at her for a moment the way one looks at a problem that has not resolved itself on schedule. Margaret, he placed a hand briefly on her shoulder. Have you thought about your living situation? Long term, there are really lovely communities now. Assisted living has come a long way. You might actually find the structure. I'm 62 years old. I know you are. He was already stepping back. You're not as sharp as you used to be, and that's okay. It's grief. It happens to all of us. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. I have to take this. We'll talk soon. Gerald can call you a car. She watched him retreat toward the corridor. She did not ask Gerald to call her a car. She walked back through the glass doors under her own power, through the parking lot, and got into the Volvo. She sat with her hands on the wheel for a moment, the engine not yet running, and looked at her own face in the rearview mirror. The glass doors of the building behind her reflected the lot. The afternoon sky. A woman sitting in an old Volvo in a visitor's space reflected her back to herself, small and still in the frame. You're not as sharp as you used to be. She turned the key and the Volvo started, reliable and unremarkable, and she pulled out of the lot without looking back at the building. But as she drove, she turned the words over in the particular way she turned things over, not emotionally, not yet, but clinically. Diagnostically. She thought about the plaque and the averted gaze and the hallway conversation conducted at elbow distance, designed to occur where no one could formally witness it. She thought about the Rolex and the Maybach and the gala invitation that had appeared in her mail 3 days after the funeral, a corporate event. Robert's company, her name not on the guest list. She thought about what a man sounds like when he believes he has already won. The Volvo moved through the Hartford County afternoon, steady and unremarked, and Margaret Vance drove home to the house that someone was planning to take from her. And for the first time since she had unfolded the condolence card and the HELOC statement from the same morning's mail, she was not crying. She was thinking. The invitation to the Vance Logistics 10-year anniversary gala had not come directly to Margaret. It had come to Hannah, who had forwarded it with a brief message. Did you know about this? Are you going? Margaret had looked at it for a long time. The embossed cardstock, the venue. Listed as the Grand Ballroom of the Hartford Marriott. The dress code noted as black tie optional in that particular font that suggested optional was not quite the right word. She had not been included on the original distribution. She had not been consulted. She had, as far as the event's logistics were concerned, not existed. She RSVP'd yes. She wore the navy dress. It was 4 years old and Robert had called it Sirius Blue with a particular approval. He reserved for things that were good without trying to announce that they were good. She'd had it altered once at the waist and it still fit, and she wore it with her good pearls and her low heels. And she drove herself to Hartford and handed her keys to the valet and walked into the grand ballroom of the Hartford Marriott. With the composed expression of a woman who has a reason to be somewhere and knows it. The room was large and warm and noisy with the particular noise of people who are performing success at each other. Champagne flutes caught the chandelier light. The floral arrangements were ambitious. A quartet played near the windows overlooking the city, their music decorative and adequate. She recognized 30 or 40 faces from her years of Robert's professional life, the investors he'd cultivated, the partners he'd argued with, the vendors who'd sent Christmas arrangements to the house every December, and she moved through the room with the slow, purposeful navigation of someone who has attended many rooms like this one and is not intimidated by any of them. She saw Chloe across the ballroom before Chloe saw her. Chloe Vance, at 45, had the carefully maintained appearance of a woman who understood that appearance was a form of argument. She stood at the center of a cluster of people Margaret recognized as significant: the Whitmore family, whose real estate holdings threaded through half the commercial corridors in Fairfield County; Gerald Chen, who sat on 2 hospital boards and 1 municipal planning commission; the Delacroix couple, who had, according to the Hartford Business Journal, recently finalized a 9-figure logistics acquisition. Chloe held her champagne at the precise angle that suggested ease without effort, and spoke with the animated focus of someone who knew exactly which faces in her circle were worth performing for. Margaret moved toward the group. She was still 6 feet away when Chloe saw her. It was a very small thing, a fractional repositioning. A slight widening of the eyes quickly corrected, and then Chloe's face arranged itself into an expression of such practiced, tender concern that Margaret almost admired the craftsmanship. Margaret, she extended both hands, touching Margaret's arm in the gesture of someone comforting someone who needs comforting. You came. We were all so worried about you. She said it to the group rather than to Margaret, a pivot that was very smooth and very deliberate. I wanted to speak with some of the board members, Margaret said pleasantly. And to represent Robert tonight. Of course. Chloe's voice dropped into a register of sorrowful delicacy. That's so like you. She's been having such a difficult time, she added. To Gerald Chen and to the Whitmore couple and to the Delacroix husband who was watching Margaret with polite uncertainty. We're all a little concerned. Well, she lowered her chin, raised it again with the expression of someone bravely managing worry. Grief does things to memory, you know. She's been making some very confusing claims about the company finances. Robert gave Marcus a loan, she keeps insisting on that. But the paperwork simply doesn't exist. Poor dear must be mixing it up with something else. Early confusion, perhaps. She tilted her head. It's so sad. The group was quiet. Margaret looked at Chloe. Chloe looked back with the gentle, open concern of a woman performing charity in public. I'm not confused, Margaret said. No, of course not, Chloe murmured, in the tone of someone humoring. Across the room, she caught a glimpse of Marcus sliding something beneath a silver tray on one of the past appetizer stations. A folded document, quickly covered by a waiter who seemed to be participating in the motion without acknowledging it. A shareholders' agreement, she noted. She had seen enough of those documents to recognize the thickness, the weight of the paper stock. He had seen her looking and had moved it before she could cross the room. She reached for a glass of water from a passing tray. Her hands were shaking. She knew they were shaking, and she knew that in a room full of people who were watching, the shaking would be read as the evidence it was being presented as. She could feel the ice against the inside of the glass, the small, hard clinks as her hand trembled. It was her blood pressure. She knew clinically, adrenaline and cortisol doing what they did, but the sound seemed very loud in the immediate space around her. And Chloe's eyes moved to her hands with the speed of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. She saw Chloe lean toward the waiter. Would you mind? Chloe said, with the gracious air of someone performing an act of care. I think the lady might need a taxi. Margaret placed the water glass on the nearest surface. I am not a ghost in this room, she said. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The cluster of people shifted, that small, involuntary reorientation of a group that has collectively decided they are witnessing something uncomfortable and would prefer not to be too directly proximate to it. The crowd's attention was brief and complete and awful in the particular way of public pity. Someone touched her elbow, a functionary, a staff member, someone fulfilling the duty of the situation, and she did not pull away. Because pulling away would have given them something, and she had nothing left to give this room. She walked to the coat check. She retrieved her coat with perfect composure. She walked through the lobby and through the revolving door and into the October air of downtown Hartford. And she stood on the sidewalk while the valet retrieved her car, and she looked at the building's lit facade and the sound of the gala, the music. The conversation, the contained warmth of all those people reached her faintly through the glass as the car pulled up. She gripped her purse in both hands until she felt her knuckles against the leather. She knew, from her years in nursing, that there were two kinds of pain. There was the pain that announced itself immediately, operatic and total, demanding all available attention. And there was the other kind of pain that arrived quietly and settled in, that revealed its dimensions slowly over the hours that followed. That turned out, when you finally took its full measure, to be larger than you had understood while you were first absorbing it. She was in the second kind. They had done it deliberately, and publicly, and with the particular efficiency of people who had planned it. The cognitive decline suggestion, the missing paperwork, the water glass and the taxi. Every move calibrated, and she had walked in without knowing the calibration had already been completed. That the room had already been prepared, that she had already been made into the story before she'd spoken a single word. She got into the Volvo and drove. The city receded behind her, its lights dimming in the rearview mirror. The road home was dark and familiar. She drove it without thinking, the way she had driven 1,000 nighttime routes home from 1,000 late hospital shifts, the muscle memory of a life she had lived competently and without asking for acknowledgement. The heater ran, the radio stayed off, the Volvo moved steadily north toward Greenwich, and Margaret Vance sat inside it. And let the silence be what it was, and let the parking lot and the ballroom and Chloe's practiced face and the sound of ice in a trembling glass settle into their proper place in the architecture of what had happened and what was still going to happen. She was not done. The power went out at 11:47 p.m. She knew the exact time because the microwave clock had been blinking since before she'd gone to bed, and when the last remaining lights cut off the small lamp in the hallway. The green glow of the cable modem on the shelf, the darkness was complete and she was awake to receive it. She had not been sleeping. She had been lying in the dark in the way that is not rest. Listening to the house settle and the wind move through the yard, and when the power went it simply removed the last fiction of ordinary function. She found the candle in the utility drawer by feel. Matchbook beside it, third drawer from the left, the way Robert had always kept it. She lit it and carried it to the kitchen and set it on the table and sat down. The kitchen at 12:30 in the morning has a particular quality. The refrigerator no longer hummed. The clock had stopped. The room held only the candlelight, which moved slowly with the air from the old windows, and the familiar shapes of objects, the chair backs, the curve of the sink. The corners of the cabinets emerged and receded at its edges. She had sat in this kitchen for 26 years. She knew its dimensions by the specific knowledge of sustained habit, the way you know. A place that you have never had reason to study because you never imagined it would be taken from you. The pill organizer sat in its usual place beside the fruit bowl. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened the Tuesday compartment. Empty. She opened Monday. One aspirin she'd left accidentally. She closed Monday. She sat with the organizer in her hands, the small plastic rectangle she'd used for years to manage her own medication compliance. The way she'd once reminded patients to manage theirs, and she thought, in the flat, clinical way that comes after emotion has done its work and left the room, about the copay she hadn't been able to cover at the pharmacy. The heart medication that regulated the arrhythmia her cardiologist had been watching since 2019. The prescription that had been refillable for 3 weeks and that she had not refilled because the co-pay was $43. And the $43 had not been available in the week she needed it because the checking account had been frozen pending the legal action Marcus's firm had filed against the Vance estate. $43. On the table in front of her was a document Marcus's attorney had mailed to her certified mail the previous Friday. She had read it in the car, in the post office parking lot, because she had not wanted to bring it inside. It was a proposal phrased in the careful language of concern that she consider a reverse mortgage arrangement, transferring the deed of the Greenwich property to a holding company for her own financial protection and peace of mind. The holding company's registered name, which appeared in a footnote on page 4, was VL Property Holdings LLC. Marcus Vance, sole registered member. The candle flame moved. The shadows at the walls moved with it, long and reaching, and Margaret looked at them and thought, with the dispassionate clarity of someone tallying a medical chart, about the state of things. The house 3 weeks from foreclosure proceedings. The bank account frozen. Hannah's college fund tied into the Vance asset structure, similarly frozen. The reverse mortgage document waiting for her signature. Her medication absent. The utility bill apparently overdue enough to constitute a cutoff, which meant she had not been paying attention to the right things at the right time, had been watching the large catastrophe and missing the small ones accumulating around it. She opened the document and looked at Marcus's attorney's name at the bottom of the last page. She thought about 40 years. She had worked for 31 of them. She had raised Hannah during the years when Robert was building the company and there was no one else to do it. She had attended every school event and managed every illness and navigated every adolescent crisis and maintained the house and hosted the dinners for the board members and written the thank you notes and remembered the children's names and sent the Christmas cards and stood beside Robert at every event, at which it was useful for him to have someone beside him who made the right impression. She had also, simply and separately from all of that, loved him. Genuinely and without performance. She had held his hand in the cardiology office when the readings came back worse than expected. She had sat with him in the evenings without talking because sometimes the evenings didn't require talking. She had known him in the specific, irreplaceable way of shared time. And she had believed, not naively but with the earned confidence of evidence, that the structure they had built together was sound. $850,000. A frozen account. An empty Tuesday compartment. A reverse mortgage proposal from a shell company registered to her brother-in-law. She pressed her palm flat against the table. She thought about the candle. In a medical context, she was still thinking in a medical context. She realized she might always think in a medical context. You assessed the situation before you acted. What do I have? What do I need? What is the immediate risk and what is the longer-term one? She ran through it. The immediate risk was the medication. $43. She had $43. She had actually, in a checking account attached to her own name rather than the joint accounts that were frozen, exactly $417. And she knew this because she had checked 3 times since last week and the number had not changed. She could get the medication tomorrow. The longer-term risk was everything else. She was 3 weeks, approximately, from being homeless. Her daughter's educational future was frozen in a legal structure she had not designed and did not control. Her husband's company, the company he had built, that bore his name, had been redecorated around the erasure of him. The only person positioned to help her was the person who had engineered the problem. The reverse mortgage on the table was not protection. It was the completion of a process that had already begun when Marcus had asked them to put the house up as collateral and Robert had agreed because he believed, or had managed himself into believing, that his brother was worth trusting one more time. She lifted her fist and brought it down on the table. The candle shuddered and held. She looked at it, the small, steady flame that had not gone out. Then she looked at the reverse mortgage proposal, at the holding company's registered name, at the footnote on page 4. "I will not die a beggar in my own home," she said to the empty kitchen. The words went into the dark and stayed there. She had not meant to say them aloud. But she was glad she had, because saying them aloud made them a fact rather than an intention. She was 62 years old, and she had 31 years of clinical practice. And she had read medication inserts and physician shorthand and insurance authorization forms, and she could read a financial document. She could read a holding company registration. She could read a footnote on page 4. She had not, she realized, been thinking about what she knew. She had been thinking about what she had lost. The candle burned down toward its base, warm and deliberate, and Margaret Vance sat in the kitchen that was almost not hers and breathed through her nose and felt something that was not hope. Exactly, hope was warmer and she was very cold right now, but was something clear. A diagnostic clarity, the kind that comes when you stop being the patient and remember you are the nurse. She pulled the reverse mortgage document toward her. She did not sign it. She turned it over and began to write, in the margin of the back page, a list. Friends, what a journey we've been on with Margaret. A woman of grace, training, and 40 years of quiet loyalty brought to the edge of everything by the very man she helped build a future for. She's lost her husband, her financial footing, her standing in a room full of people who used to respect her. She's sitting in a dark kitchen at midnight with an empty pill organizer and a reverse mortgage she will not sign. But here's what Marcus Vance has never understood, and what this story is about to show him: a woman who spent 30 years reading what others missed doesn't stop reading. She just changes what she's looking for. Stay with us. The best part is still to come. She found him in the memory the way you find something you didn't know you were looking for. It was not triggered by anything dramatic. She had moved from the kitchen to Robert's study at some point in the hours after midnight, carrying the candle. Sitting in his chair with the list she'd made in the margins of Marcus's document. She was going through the mental inventory of every Vance logistics filing she had ever touched or witnessed or been peripherally present for years: of dinner table conversation, of documents signed in her presence, of the particular way Robert had worked, methodical and redundant, and always with a copy somewhere. He had not trusted banks with originals. He had not trusted cloud storage. He had trusted physical paper in specific places that he alone knew, because he had grown up watching his father lose everything to a fire that destroyed a single folder. Even dreams need a fail-safe. The memory arrived intact 3 months before the accident. A Sunday, because he'd been in the study on a Sunday and she'd brought him coffee and noticed the blueprints spread across the drafting table, not architectural drawings, as she'd assumed, but HELOC papers, the original loan documents, marked in his handwriting in the margins with calculations. She hadn't looked at closely because she'd trusted him, and the coffee had been getting cold. He had been unusually still. Robert was not a still man by nature, he thought with movement, with the slight restlessness of someone for whom ideas were physical. That Sunday he had been very still. Marcus thinks I'm the dreamer. He had said it without looking up from the papers. But even dreams need a fail-safe. She had not asked him what he meant because she had thought she understood, and because the coffee was getting cold, and because she had been 62 years old and Robert had been 64. And she had believed, with the deep, unexamined certainty of long marriage, that there was time for every conversation. She looked at the drafting table. It had been Robert's before they married, a vintage piece, steel-legged and heavy, that he'd salvaged from an office liquidation in 1987 and carried from apartment to apartment, and eventually into this house, where it had lived in his study for 26 years. Marcus had not taken it. Marcus preferred the modern. He would have looked at this table and seen a liability, something awkward and old-fashioned and not worth the effort of removal. She ran her fingers along the underside of the surface, found the velvet inlay decorative. She had always assumed Robert had installed it himself, years ago, telling her it softened the working surface for large drawings. She pulled at the edge. The velvet came away from the frame in a single piece, attached at 3 corners and free at the 4th, and beneath it was a shallow recess barely an inch deep, and in the recess, 2 items. A small blue folder, elastic banded closed, dense with paper. And beneath that, an envelope addressed in Robert's handwriting for Margaret, when needed. Her hands were not shaking. She opened the folder first because she was still the nurse and nurses assess the situation before they process it. The document inside was a shareholder buyback clause, 4 pages, attached to the original HELOC agreement. The language was specific and cleanly drafted. In the event of loan default by the borrowing party Vance Logistics, the collateral reverted not to the bank but to the lending party. In the event of verified misappropriation of loan funds, 80% of Vance Logistics voting shares transferred immediately to the lending party or their designated estate. The clause was signed by Robert Vance. It was signed by a notary public. It was dated the same week the HELOC had been executed. It was also signed, on the second page, by Marcus Vance. His signature, looping and confident, the signature of a man who had not read what he was signing carefully enough, or had read it and believed it would never be relevant because he had believed, as predatory. People often believe that he was the only one who had thought of contingencies. She sat with the folder for a long time. Outside, the power came back on. The hallway lamp lit. The modem's green light blinked from the shelf. The refrigerator resumed its hum. The house returned to its ordinary electronic presence as though nothing had changed. She opened the envelope. Robert's handwriting, familiar and precise. I hope you never need this. But I know Marcus, and I love him, and I know what loving someone and knowing them at the same time means. Everything you need is in the blue folder. Arthur will know what to do. I'm sorry I couldn't make him different. I'm glad I could make this. She read it twice. Then she held it against her chest, the paper cool and dry against the fabric of her robe, and she breathed. She did not cry. She had done her crying in the weeks between the funeral and the midnight kitchen. And what she felt now was beyond the register of tears. It was grief and fury and something that felt, against all recent evidence, like love. The blueprint of her life had not been destroyed. It had been waiting, patient and precise, for her to find it. Arthur Sterling had the face of a man who had heard everything and been surprised by very little of it, the durable, undemonstrative face of someone who had spent 4 decades in estate law absorbing the distance between what families appeared to be and what they actually were. He was 65 years old and Robert's oldest friend. They had met in a constitutional law seminar in 1981. Both bored by the professor and both, it emerged, intensely interested in the structural elegance of how agreements were enforced. He had been Robert's attorney for 30 years and his friend for longer. And he had delivered the eulogy at the service with the careful precision of a man who was also very carefully not saying several things. She called him from Robert's study at 6 in the morning. He picked up on the second ring. I found it, she said. A pause. Tell me what you found. She told him. He was quiet throughout, and she had known Arthur long enough to understand that his quietness was not disengagement. It was the particular concentration of someone who is listening to everything at once, the words and the implications of the words and the space between the words where the meaning lives. When she finished, he asked her to read him the specific language of the buyback clause. She read it. He was quiet again for a long moment. Margaret, his voice, when it came, was low and careful. Do not let that document out of your possession. Do not photograph it. Do not scan it. Put it in something you carry on your person and do not put it down. Are you hearing me? I'm hearing you. I need to see you today. They met at a diner in North Haven at 11 Arthur's Choice, a place called Polly's that had been operating since 1974 and whose primary virtues, he explained when she arrived, were that the coffee was good and no one in Fairfield County's business community would be found eating there. He was already in the back booth, his coat on the seat beside him, a cup of coffee going cold in the same way hers had gone cold in Greenwich 2 weeks ago. He stood when he saw her, which was the kind of reflex that had been trained into him long enough ago to be genuine rather than performative. She placed the blue folder on the table in front of him. He read it without speaking. She watched his face. His expression moved only at the outer edges, a slight tightening around the eyes at the notary stamp. A brief stillness when he reached the second page with Marcus's signature. He turned to the third page, then back to the first. Then he set it flat on the table and looked at her. "This isn't just a loan document," he said. "This is a collateralized transfer of authority." Robert built a trigger mechanism directly into the HELOC structure. He turned the second page toward her. "Marcus signed this." "He signed it, Margaret." Either he didn't read it or he read it and assumed the trigger would never be pulled. "He assumed Robert would never plan for him to betray us," she said. Arthur looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I think that's right." The 48 hours that followed had the quality of the controlled emergency, the kind she recognized from her years in the clinical unit. The hours when everything moves fast and the only way to manage speed is to be very organized and very calm and never let urgency become panic, because panic costs time. She slept 4 hours the first night. She spent the rest of it at Robert's desk with the laptop, pulling bank records, cross-referencing transaction dates, building the timeline that the documents suggested and that the records were beginning to confirm. The HELOC funds had been disbursed in 4 tranches over 14 months. She matched each tranche to the business purpose documentation Marcus had filed with the bank. Expansion of logistics infrastructure, capital equipment acquisition, payroll support during the restructuring period. Standard, plausible, filed correctly. And then she found the disbursement that did not match. $340,000. Moved through a subsidiary account, BL Cayman Holdings Limited, to a brokerage registered in the Cayman Islands. She pulled the subsidiary's registration. She found the asset listing filed with the Cayman Authority. A vessel, a 62-foot sailing yacht, registered under Marcus Vance's personal name, purchased the same month the logistics, capital equipment acquisition, had been funded. Clear misappropriation of funds designated for business purpose. Direct violation of the HELOC's use of funds clause. She printed the records. She organized them by date and cross-indexed them against the buyback clause. She called the HR director Marcus had terminated the previous spring, a woman named Diane Cho, who had 22 years at Vance Logistics and who had been escorted from the building on a Thursday afternoon with 40 minutes notice and a severance package contingent on her signing an NDA. Margaret called her at home. Diane Cho was quiet for a long moment when Margaret explained what she'd found, and then she said he changed the board minutes from March. "I saw him do it. I have the originals." Margaret wrote Arthur's fax number on a piece of paper and read it to her. She met Arthur again on Thursday morning, in his offices in New Haven this time. The formal version of their meeting, with the folder and the bank records and the printed transaction history laid across the conference table. She watched him read through everything with the same quiet attention he'd brought to the diner booth, and when he'd finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The misappropriation alone triggers the clause," he said. "With the board minutes, we have evidence of deliberate concealment. With the yacht, we have a paper trail through an international account." He looked at her. "This is a criminal matter in addition to a civil one, Margaret. I want you to understand what you're starting." "I know what I'm starting." She slid the retainer check across the table. She had calculated it against the $417 in her personal account, and the settlement from her 401k early withdrawal, and the small amount she'd borrowed, calling it borrowing, had felt important from Hannah without explaining why. "Don't just sue them, Arthur. Evict them from my life." He looked at the check, then at her. He had known her for 30 years, long enough to understand that evict was not a casual word choice. "There will be a hearing," he said. "And then, if the clause is upheld as drafted, which it will be, because Robert was meticulous. And this language is airtight, I'll need you in that boardroom." "I'll be there." She walked back to her car through the October morning, the kind of New England day that is clear and cold and absolutely indifferent. The kind that asks nothing of you and gives back exactly as much. The elm trees along Whitney Avenue were in their late turning colors. Not the dramatic reds of peak fall, but the deeper, more complicated colors that come after the burnt ambers and worn golds of something that has lasted longer than the spectacle. She stood beside the Volvo for a moment and breathed the cold air. She had spent 30 years in nursing. She had managed codes and traumas and the controlled chaos of a full ward on a short-staffed night. And she had understood, as a fundamental condition of that work, that the difference between surviving a crisis and being consumed by it was almost entirely a matter of clarity. Knowing what was true, knowing what came next, acting on what you knew rather than on what you feared. She knew what was true. She knew what came next. She got into the Volvo and drove back toward Greenwich and the house she was about to save. The quarterly earnings call was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, which meant the board members would begin arriving at Vance Logistics at 8:30, coffee in hand, prepared for the ritual of organized optimism that quarterly calls had become under Marcus's tenure. Polished slides, careful language, the steady management of information that revealed as little as possible while conveying the impression of transparency. Marcus was good at this. He had the instincts of a performer, the ability to be convincing in a room, to make the version of the story he was telling feel like the only version that existed. Margaret arrived at 8:15. She wore Robert's favorite black suit, a structured, sharply cut piece she'd bought for a conference 12 years ago and worn to precisely the occasions that required her to be taken seriously without asking to be. She'd had her hair done the afternoon before. She carried the blue folder and Arthur's briefcase, and Arthur walked beside her, and behind Arthur were two Fairfield County Sheriff's deputies with a court order, and the particular energy of that procession. Moving through the lobby of Vance Logistics, Gerald Simmons at the desk, watching them come through the glass doors with an expression that Margaret would remember as relief. The specific relief of a man who has been waiting a long time for something to resolve had the quality of inevitability. The elevator banks were to the left. The boardroom was on the 4th floor. Arthur pressed the button. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Clinical," she said. He nodded, as though that was exactly the right answer. Marcus was already in the boardroom when they arrived, standing at the head of the table with the Vance Logistics CFO and two board members. She recognized, his jacket on, his presentation clicker in his hand, his expression in the mode she had seen him deploy all her adult life, confident, in command, the room arranged around him the way he preferred rooms to be arranged. He looked up when the door opened, and the configuration of his expression shifted almost immediately. A flash of something underneath the composure, quickly covered, like a card turned briefly face up and then laid back down. "This is a closed executive meeting," he said. Arthur set his briefcase on the table. "It's a hearing, Marcus. The Superior Court of Fairfield County issued the order this morning." He slid a copy across the table. One of the sheriff's deputies positioned himself at the door. The other remained just inside it. "We're not here to interrupt the call. We're here to execute a legally ordered shareholder action. You don't have standing. The lending party in a collateralized transfer of authority absolutely has standing," Arthur said. The clause was executed contemporaneously with the helic and notarized by Catherine Birch of the New Haven County Clerk's Office. "You signed it, Marcus." Page 2. The CFO, a cautious man named Terrence Webb, who had been with the company 8 years and whom Robert had trusted because he didn't embellish numbers, looked from Arthur to Marcus with the expression of someone rapidly recalculating a position. The two board members were still. The room had the particular quality of a space in which everyone is processing new information at different speeds and no one wants to be the first to speak. Margaret walked to the head of the table. She stood where Marcus had been standing. She placed the blue folder in front of her and looked at the room, at the faces she recognized. The board members she had fed dinners to, the CFO, who had sent a condolence card, the windows overlooking the company her husband had built, and she spoke clearly and without preamble. "Today, the court wrote in ink what my heart had been shouting in silence." The room held. She opened the folder and laid the documents flat on the table, one beside the other in the order she and Arthur had prepared: the original buyback clause, the transaction records, the Cayman account documentation, the yacht registration, Diane Cho's affidavit with the original board minutes. She did not speak quickly. She had spent 30 years in rooms where people needed to understand things that were complicated and frightening. And she had learned that clarity requires pace. Robert structured the HELOC with a transfer clause because he knew his brother, she said. He knew that ambition without accountability eventually collapses inward. The clause was clear loan default plus verified misappropriation of designated funds. Triggers automatic transfer of 80% of Vance Logistics voting shares to the lending party. She looked at the board members. That's me. That transfer was ordered by the court this morning. Marcus moved. This is, he stepped toward the table, his voice carrying the particular edge of someone who is used to volume being effective. This is a fabrication. Those documents are signed by you, Arthur said. Notarized. Dated. I have the notary's verification on file. He placed a second document on the table. I also have the transfer of funds documentation for VL Cayman Holdings Limited, which was used to purchase a 62-foot sailing vessel in the Cayman Islands using capital designated for business infrastructure. That is wire fraud, Marcus, in addition to breach of contract. One of the sheriff's deputies stepped forward. Marcus looked at him, looked at the table, looked at the documents laid out in sequence like the chapters of a very specific story. The story of what he had actually done versus the story he had been telling, and his face did something that Margaret had not expected and would not quite be able to describe later. It went gray, not flushed, not angry, not the heated red of confrontation. It went the flat, exhausted gray of someone who has been running a very long race and has just realized, precisely and without ambiguity, that it is over. Chloe came in from the side corridor at that moment. She had the alert, composed energy of someone who had been in an adjacent room and had heard voices not calibrated to their expected pitch. She looked at the table, at the documents, at the deputies, at Margaret, standing at the head of the conference table in Robert's black suit, and she opened her mouth. Margaret picked up the shareholders' agreement, the one Marcus had slid under the silver tray at the gala, recovered through discovery, and slid it across the table toward Chloe. You said I was confused, Margaret said. I've never been clearer. Chloe's mouth closed. The two board members looked at each other. Terrence Webb had his phone out and was, Margaret noticed, already scrolling, looking something up. Confirming something. The cautious movement of a man protecting himself before a structure falls. One of the board members, Gerald Chen, whom she had met 3 weeks ago at the gala while Chloe was suggesting she take a taxi, set his coffee cup down very carefully and said, to no one in particular, Marcus, did you know about the Cayman account? Marcus said nothing. You didn't just kill Robert's legacy, Margaret said. She was not raising her voice. The glass walls of the boardroom carried her words without effort. You tried to bury me with it. Every call you didn't return. The hallway at your office instead of a seat. The gala and Chloe's performance about my cognition and the taxi you tried to send me home in. The reverse mortgage to your own shell company that you mailed to me while the power was off in my kitchen. She paused. I'm taking the shovel back. The deputies moved. It was not dramatic, the way it happened. No one raised their voice. No one ran. The legal mechanism simply executed itself. The document, the order, the authority that Arthur had spent the previous 2 weeks assembling. And Marcus Vance and Chloe Vance were escorted from the boardroom of the company that bore Marcus's name, and would shortly bear it no longer, and the door closed behind them, and the sound of it closing was very ordinary. Margaret stood at the head of the conference table and breathed. The room was quiet. Gerald Chen was looking at the shareholders' agreement. Terrence Webb had put his phone away. Through the windows, the Hartford skyline was clear and bright under the October sky. The same sky it always was, indifferent to what had just occurred, continuing with the business of being a sky. Arthur put his hand briefly on her arm. It'll take 6 to 8 weeks to complete the transfer formally, he said. But the order holds. Nothing moves without your signature now. She looked at the table, at the documents laid out in Robert's careful sequence, at the notary stamp on the buyback clause, the date that matched the week they had signed the HELOC, the date Robert had known what he was doing and why, the date he had tucked a small blue folder into the back of a vintage drafting table because even dreams needed a fail-safe. "Thank you, Robert," she said quietly. She wasn't sure she'd said it aloud until she saw Arthur's expression. She began to gather the documents. The cottage in Old Saybrook faced southwest, which meant the afternoon light came through the front windows at an angle that crossed the kitchen floor in long, warm strips and reached, by 4 o'clock, the back wall of the small sitting room where she kept Robert's drafting table. She had brought the drafting table with her. It was the one thing from the Greenwich house she had not sold or given away. Everything else, the colonial itself, the furniture, the accumulated objects of 26 years, had been sold, cleanly and at reasonable market price, to a young couple from Stamford, who had a daughter starting kindergarten and who had stood in the kitchen and looked at each other with the specific expression of people who are about to make the most important decision of their lives. She had shaken their hands and felt something she could only describe as unclenched. The house had been Robert's and hers together, which meant it had also been Marcus's leverage, and she was done with leverage. The cottage on the Long Island Sound was hers alone. She stood on the porch with her coffee in the early morning. The Sound was calm today, gray-green and glittering at the horizon. The kind of early November water that had put its summer behind it and settled into its more serious self. A cormorant sat on the stone breakwater 50 yards out, drying its wings in the thin sunlight. She watched it with the unhurried attention that had become, she was discovering, one of the unexpected compensations of a simplified life. The 401k was restored. Arthur had managed the recovery as part of the civil settlement. She had not pursued criminal charges against Marcus, which was her choice and which she had made with the same clinical deliberateness with which she had made every other choice in the past 3 months. It was not mercy, exactly. It was the decision of a woman who had assessed the costs and benefits of prolonged adversarial engagement, and concluded that what she wanted was not to see Marcus punished but to be free of him. He had resigned from Vance Logistics and was, according to the last communication from Arthur's office, dealing with a separate SEC inquiry into the Cayman account. Chloe had filed for divorce. These were not her problems. She had sold the company to a competitor from the Midwest, a logistics firm called Meridian Group, whose CEO had flown to Connecticut to meet her and whose manner had been straightforward in the way of people who are accustomed to dealing fairly because they understand that fair dealing is efficient. She had received the sale price she'd asked for. The HELOC was discharged from the proceeds. There was enough left, combined with the restored 401k and the proceeds from the Greenwich sale, that she had bought the cottage without a mortgage, and left a reasonable amount in an account she did not touch. She went back inside and set her cup in the sink. The community clinic in Old Saybrook was a 15-minute drive, and she had been volunteering there 3 mornings a week since September. It was a walk-in clinic serving primarily uninsured and underinsured patients, young families, agricultural workers, some elderly residents whose access to the hospital system was complicated by distance and income and the accumulated barriers of lives that did not come with built-in safety nets. She had not practiced formally in 8 years, and she did not practice formally now. She assisted, she took vitals. She helped patients navigate paperwork and understand their discharge instructions. She did the work that requires clinical knowledge, but not a current license. And she did it with the particular attentiveness of someone who is doing a thing because it is the right thing to do and not because they are required to. She checked blood pressure and oxygen saturation and respiratory rate for young mothers who were nervous about their newborns, and she explained the numbers clearly and without condescension. And she watched their faces settle from anxiety into understanding. And she recognized, in that settling, the thing she had loved about nursing in the first place. The letter from Marcus's attorney arrived on a Thursday. She recognized the firm's name on the envelope. Different attorney, same firm. She carried it inside and set it on the drafting table, which was the only surface in the cottage that faced south, and she stood with the envelope in her hands for a moment. She was aware of what it would contain: the language of reconciliation and family, and perhaps some version of the word misunderstanding. The carefully assembled vocabulary of people who have exhausted their options and are recalibrating their approach. She carried it to the small office off the kitchen, where she kept the shredder. She placed the sealed envelope in the feed slot. The machine ran for approximately 4 seconds. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink, dried them on the dish towel, and went back to the porch. The sun had moved. It was past 3 o'clock, and the light on the sound had shifted to the deeper gold of late afternoon. The particular quality of light that November makes in southern New England warmer looking than the air actually is, the light apologizing, in its way, for the cold it cannot prevent. The water moved steadily. The cormorant was gone from the breakwater. The sky above the sound was the clear, fathomless blue of a day that has decided to be beautiful without explanation. She thought about Robert, not with grief now or not only with grief. She thought about him with the complicated, full-weighted feeling of someone who has had time to see a person whole, his foresight and his blind spots and the particular way he had loved her. Which included, it turned out, planning for the worst while hoping for the best. She thought about the blue folder in the drafting table's velvet recess, about the note on paper in his handwriting, about the word fail-safe said on a Sunday morning, when she had not quite understood what he was protecting. She thought about how love sometimes looks like paperwork, how it sometimes looks like a notarized signature on a clause you hope will never be needed. How it is, in the end, a form of architecture, the careful structuring of support for someone who doesn't know the structure is there. She had signed the lease for the cottage herself. Her own name, her own signature, the one she'd been writing since she was 9 years old. The one she'd put on nursing school applications and marriage certificates and medical records and prescription pads. The signature that was simply her, unchanged through everything she had put it on the lease, and the pen had felt, in her hand, like something she recognized. At 62, she had learned what she'd always suspected but never needed to test, that starting over is not the thing that happens when you lose. It is the thing that happens when you are finally free of everything that was built on someone else's terms. The Long Island Sound moved in the way that large bodies of water move, indifferently, continuously, without concern for the events of the small lives occurring at its edges. She breathed its salt air. She thought about Hannah calling last Sunday from Boston, her voice warm and easy in the way it had not been for months while everything was uncertain. Calling just to talk, just to check in, the way children call when they are not worried. She thought about the clinic tomorrow morning and the young mother she'd seen Tuesday who had come back in with a follow-up question, not because anything was wrong, but because someone had taken the time to explain things clearly and she had felt, apparently, that she could return. She finished her coffee. She was not a relic. She was not a ghost. She was not confused. She was a woman who had been to the edge of everything and come back with the documents to prove it, and she was standing on the porch of a cottage she owned without debt, breathing the salt air of the Long Island Sound on a November afternoon, and the sun was going down in shades of gold and violet over the water. And she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Friends, how did you find today's story? Margaret Vance came to us with the HELOC statement in her lap and the lilies going cold and a phone that kept going to voicemail. She left us standing on the porch of a cottage she owns outright, watching the sun go down over the Long Island Sound. The distance between those two moments, that's what we spent today traveling. I think about what Margaret actually teaches us, and it isn't quite what it looks like on the surface. It looks like a story about betrayal and legal documents and a buyback clause in a blue folder. But underneath that, it's a story about the kind of clarity that only arrives after you stopped hoping someone will save you. That 3 o'clock kitchen no power, empty pill organizer, a reverse mortgage proposal, designed to take the last thing she had. That's where Margaret Vance stopped being a victim and started being a nurse again. Started assessing instead of grieving. Started asking, what do I know? What do I need? What comes next? There's something that happens when we face the worst thing, and I don't mean a dramatic, movie version worst thing. I mean the quiet, grinding kind. The kind that arrives in registered mail and averted eyes and a hallway conversation that takes place outside an office you're not invited into. There's something that happens when all of that accumulates and you sit in a dark kitchen at midnight and you realize no one is coming, and somehow, in that realization, You become capable of things you didn't know you were capable of. Robert Vance left Margaret a clause in a document. But what he really left her was proof that he had believed, all along, that she could handle whatever Marcus would eventually become. He built the fail-safe because he trusted her to find it. She found it. At 62 years old, Margaret signed her own name on a fresh lease, and it felt like it belonged to her. I think that's worth sitting with for a moment. Whatever age you are watching this from, whatever room you're in right now, your name belongs to you. Don't let anyone else put it on their documents. I hope today's story brought you something you needed. If it did, please subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And hit that like button. It helps more than you know, and if this community has taught me anything, it's that small actions, done consistently, change everything. We'll see you next time. Take good care of yourselves.